the seed keeper Zephyra. Zephyra walked barefoot through the mindful garden, her pockets heavy with seeds of every shape and size. Some were round and smooth, like river stones, others sharp and angular, like tiny stars. She had been the garden's seed keeper for as long as memory stretched, though she appeared no older than 20 springs. Her hands carried the wisdom of countless plantings, each finger knowing exactly which seed belonged to which soil. Tonight she felt restless. The moon hung like a silver coin above the garden, casting long shadows between the rows of sleeping flowers. Zephyra reached into her left pocket and pulled out a seed. Unlike any other, it was completely transparent, like crystallized air. She had carried this seed for years, never knowing where to plant it, never understanding its purpose. She wandered past the herb spiral, where lavender and rosemary released their evening perfume. The transparent seed grew warm, in her palm pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Zephyra paused at the edge of a small clearing, where nothing had ever grown, despite her many attempts. The soil there was neither rich nor poor, neither wet nor dry. It simply waited, patient and empty. Kneeling in the soft earth, Zephyra held the seed up to the moonlight. Through its transparent surface, she could see tiny swirls of possibility, like galaxies spinning in miniature. She pressed her ear to the ground and listened to the deep silence that lived beneath all the garden's sounds. In that silence, she heard something unexpected, the sound of her own doubt, her own fear of planting something she did not understand. The seed keeper realized she had been carrying this seed, not because she didn't know where to plant it, but because she feared what might grow. What if nothing sprouted? What if something grew that she couldn't tend? Her fingers trembled as she dug a small hole in the waiting earth. The transparent seed caught the moonlight one last time before disappearing into the dark soil. Zephyra sat back on her heels and waited. Minutes passed like hours. Then slowly, a tiny shoot emerged, not green but silver, like captured moonlight. As she watched, it grew into a delicate plant with leaves that shimmered between visible and invisible, there and not there. She reached out to touch it, and her hand passed through, like touching mist, yet she felt its essence against her palm. The plant continued, growing its ethereal branches, reaching toward the stars. Zephyra understood then that some seeds are meant to grow into questions, rather than answers, into possibilities, rather than certainties. This was the seed of wonder itself, and it could only bloom when planted without expectation, tended without attachment. As dawn approached, the silvery plant began to fade with the moonlight, but Zephyra felt no sadness. She knew it would return each night, a reminder that the most beautiful growth comes from embracing uncertainty. The lesson settled in her heart like morning dew. Sometimes we must plant our doubts to harvest our courage. In the mindful garden of possibilities, even invisible growth creates real beauty. The dreamweaver Myrthen sat cross-legged beneath the ancient magnolia tree, her fingers moving through the air as if threading invisible needles. She was the garden's dreamweaver, spinning stories from moonbeams and whispers into gossamer threads that would drift into the sleeping minds of those who wandered the garden paths. Her hair floated around her shoulders like spun silver, and her eyes held the depth of midnight pools. Tonight felt different. The dreams she wove kept unraveling before completion, the delicate threads dissolving the moment she tried to bind them together. Myrthen paused in her work and gazed up through the magnolia's broad leaves. The stars seemed dimmer than usual, as if they too were having trouble maintaining their light. She felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest, the same feeling that came when perfection slipped just beyond her reach. She had always prided herself on crafting flawless dreams, stories so beautiful and complete that they carried sleepers into realms of perfect peace. Each thread had to be exactly the right thickness, each color precisely matched to the dreamer's needs. But tonight, her usual precision felt heavy, like trying to paint with lead brushes. The harder she concentrated, the more her threads tangled and broke. A gentle breeze stirred the magnolia petals, causing them to fall like snow around Marathon. One petal landed on her palm, and she noticed its edges were imperfect, slightly torn, with a small brown spot near the center. Yet it was beautiful, precisely because of these flaws carrying the story of wind and weather, of growth and gentle decay. She held it up to the starlight and saw how its imperfections caught the light in ways a perfect petal never could. Myrthen closed her eyes and breathed deeply, releasing her grip on the need for perfection. When she opened them, she began weaving again, but this time she allowed the threads to flow naturally. Some were thicker, some thinner. Some caught the light brilliantly. Others remained in shadow. As she worked, she noticed the dreams taking shape in ways she hadn't planned, more alive, more real than her carefully constructed visions had ever been. The first dream floated away like a dandelion seed carrying imperfect beauty to a restless sleeper. Then another and another, each one unique, each one flawed, each one perfect in its imperfection. Myrthen felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in seasons, as if she had been holding her breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. As the night deepened, Myrthen continued her work with playful curiosity rather than determined precision. She wove dreams with loose ends and unexpected turns, stories that meandered like garden paths, rather than rushing toward predetermined destinations. The sleeping garden seemed to sigh with contentment as these new dreams drifted through the air like gentle mist. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, Myrthen gathered her remaining threads and smiled. She had discovered something beautiful in letting go, in allowing her work to breathe and flow. The lesson settled in her heart, like morning dew. True beauty lives not in perfection, but in the courage to be authentically flawed. In the mindful garden of dreams, the most healing stories are woven with threads of honest imperfection. The mirror polisher Kythera. Kythera moved through the mindful garden with a cloth made of spider silk and morning mist, polishing mirrors that hung from the branches of ancient trees. Each mirror was different, some round as full moons, others shaped like teardrops or leaves. They reflected not just images, but moments of truth that passers-by needed to see. Kythera had been polishing these mirrors since the garden's beginning, though she herself cast no reflection in any of them. Tonight she paused before a mirror that had troubled her for many seasons. No matter how carefully she polished it, the surface remained clouded, showing only dim shadows and unclear shapes. Other mirrors sang with clarity after her touch, but this one remained stubbornly opaque. Kythera had tried every technique she knew, gentle circular motions, firm straight strokes, even leaving it to catch the morning dew, but nothing cleared its surface. She sat on a stone bench, facing the clouded mirror, her cloth resting in her lap. The mirror hung from a cherry tree, whose blossoms had long since fallen, leaving only green leaves that whispered secrets to the night wind. Kythera studied her own reflection in the mirror's murky surface and saw only a vague outline, a suggestion of presence rather than a clear image. For the first time in countless nights, she wondered what the mirror was meant to show. As she sat in contemplation, a young fox approached and settled beside the bench. The fox looked up at the clouded mirror and tilted its head as if seeing something Kythera could not. Together they watched as shapes moved within the mirror's depths, not reflections of the garden around them, but something else entirely. Kythera realized the mirror was not broken or dirty. It was simply showing something that could not be seen, clearly something that lived in the spaces between certainty and doubt. She reached out and touched the mirror's surface with her bare hand instead of her cloth. The glass felt warm, pulsing gently, like a sleeping heart. As her palm pressed against it, the cloudiness began to shift and swirl, forming patterns that reminded her of water flowing over stones of clouds, changing shape in an endless sky. The mirror was showing her the beauty of transition itself, the sacred space where one thing becomes another. Kythera understood then that some mirrors are not meant to show clear images, but to reflect the mystery that lives at the heart of all seeing. This mirror held the wisdom of uncertainty, the truth that some things become clearer only when we stop trying to force them into focus. She had been polishing it to make it show what she expected, rather than accepting what it was meant to reveal. She sat back and watched as the mirror's surface continued its gentle dance of light and shadow. The fox beside her seemed to nod in approval before padding silently back into the garden. Kythera folded her cloth and hung it on a nearby branch. Tonight, instead of polishing, she would simply witness the beauty of not knowing, the grace of questions without answers. As the night deepened, Kythera remained on the bench, learning to see with new eyes. The clouded mirror had become her teacher, showing her that clarity is not always about sharp edges and perfect reflections. Sometimes, the most important truths live in the mist, between seeing and not seeing, in the gentle blur where certainty softens into wonder. When dawn approached, Kythera rose and continued her rounds, but she left the clouded mirror untouched. She had learned something precious in its murky depths. Not everything needs to be crystal clear to be perfectly true. In the mindful garden of reflection, sometimes the most beautiful mirrors are those that show us the mystery rather than the answer. The time-tender Solène moved through the mindful garden, with pockets full of hourglasses, each one filled with sand of a different color. Golden sand, for moments of joy; silver, for times of quiet reflection; deep blue, for periods of growth that came disguised as difficulty. She was the garden's time-tender, responsible for helping moments ripen at their own pace, never forcing the slow ones to hurry or the quick ones to linger. Her footsteps made no sound on the garden paths, as if she walked between seconds, rather than upon the earth. Tonight she carried a new hourglass, one that had appeared on her doorstep that morning. Its sand was unlike any she had seen. It shifted colors constantly, sometimes transparent, sometimes deep purple, sometimes the pale green of new leaves. The glass itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting gently as if alive. Solène had studied it for hours, but could not determine what kind of time it contained. She wandered past the night-blooming cereus flowers that opened only once a year for a single night. Their sweet fragrance filled the air with the essence of precious moments, reminders that some beauty exists only in its briefness. Solène paused to watch one flower slowly unfold its white petals, each movement deliberate and unhurried. The mysterious hourglass in her pocket grew warm as she witnessed this ancient dance of time and bloom. A wooden bench sat beneath a constellation of fireflies, their gentle lights creating a living chandelier in the darkness. Solène settled there and drew out the shifting hourglass, holding it up to catch the fireflies' glow. As the light passed through the sand, she saw something extraordinary. The grains weren't just changing color, they were changing speed. Some fell quickly, like summer rain, others drifted down like autumn leaves, and some seemed to hover in mid-air, as if suspended in honey. She realized this hourglass contained not one type of time, but all time the rushing moments of excitement, the languid hours of peace, the suspended seconds of deep presence. It was filled with the sand of lived experience, each grain a moment that had been fully felt, rather than simply passed through. Solène understood that she had been chosen to tend this special timepiece, to learn its rhythm and wisdom as she watched the sand begin to settle into a steady breathing rhythm, fast and slow, in perfect balance, like the heartbeat of the garden itself. Solène felt her own breathing synchronize with the hourglass's flow. She no longer tried to understand its colors or predict its patterns. Instead, she simply witnessed its dance, allowing herself to be present with its ever-changing nature. The fireflies around her seemed to pulse in harmony with the hourglass, creating a symphony of light and time that flowed through the garden like a gentle river. Solène felt herself becoming part of this rhythm, not watching time pass, but participating in its sacred flow. She understood that the hourglass was teaching her about presence itself, about the art of being fully alive in each moment, regardless of its pace or color. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had become fluid, meaningful, not for its duration, but for its depth. Solène noticed that when she tried to grasp a particular moment or push away an uncomfortable feeling, the hourglass's sand would swirl chaotically. But when she relaxed into whatever was present, the sand flowed with elegant grace, each grain finding its perfect place in the endless dance of becoming. As dawn approached, Solène carefully returned the hourglass to her pocket. She had learned its most important lesson, that time is not something to be managed or controlled, but something to be danced with, something to be lived fully in each precious, irreplaceable moment. The garden around her seemed to shimmer with new vitality, every leaf and petal alive with the presence she had learned to cultivate. Walking back through the awakening garden, Solène felt the hourglass pulse gently against her side. She had become its keeper, not by understanding it, but by surrendering to its wisdom. The lesson flowed through her like morning light. True time is not measured in minutes or hours, but in the depth of our presence with whatever is. In the mindful garden of moments, every second holds eternity when we learn to truly inhabit it. The silent shepherd Illyrian walked through the mindful garden, carrying a staff carved from petrified wind, its surface smooth as river stones and light as birdsong. He was the garden's silent shepherd, gathering the scattered quiet moments that hid between sounds and weaving them into pools of deep peace. His hair was the color of twilight, and his eyes held the profound stillness of mountain lakes. Where he walked, the garden's natural sounds seemed to arrange themselves into perfect harmony, creating spaces where silence could bloom like invisible flowers. Tonight the garden buzzed with unusual activity. Crickets chirped frantically, leaves rustled without wind, and even the stones seemed to hum with nervous energy. Illyrian felt the disturbance in his chest, like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. He had never encountered such restless noise in all his years of tending the garden's quiet spaces. The silence he usually gathered so easily scattered like startled birds the moment he approached. He paused by the fountain, at the garden's heart, where water normally fell in gentle, rhythmic drops. Tonight, it bubbled and splashed with agitation, as if the very water had forgotten how to be still. Illyrian dipped his staff into the fountain's pool and felt the water's anxiety flow up through the ancient wood. The garden itself was experiencing something he had never felt before, the fear of being truly heard, truly seen. As understanding dawned, Illyrian realized the garden was preparing for something significant. All the restless energy, the nervous sounds, the inability to settle into stillness. It was like a great intake of breath before an important word is spoken. The garden was not broken. It was pregnant, with possibility vibrating with the anticipation of transformation. The silence he had been trying to gather was not absent, but waiting coiled like a spring beneath all the surface noise. Illyrian sat beside the fountain and laid his staff across his knees. Instead of trying to quiet the garden's agitation, he began to listen to it with deep attention. He heard the fear in the cricket's urgent chorus, the longing in the restless leaves, the hope in the bubbling water. Each sound carried a message, a prayer, a dream that had been held too long in silence and was finally ready to be expressed. As he listened without trying to change anything, something remarkable happened. The garden's sounds began to organize themselves around his presence, not into silence, but into a complex symphony of authentic expression. The crickets found their natural rhythm, the leaves whispered their ancient secrets, and the fountain began to sing rather than splash. Illyrian realized he had been shepherding the wrong kind of silence, the silence of suppression, rather than the silence of deep listening. The staff in his hands began to glow with soft light, not the light of trying to control, but the light of witnessing. Illyrian understood that his role was not to create silence by stopping sound, but to create the kind of listening that allowed every voice to find its true place. He was not a silence shepherd, after all, but a harmony tender, helping each part of the garden find its authentic voice within the greater song. Hours passed. As Illyrian sat in this new understanding, his presence creating a field of deep listening that allowed the garden to express itself fully. The restless energy gradually settled into something far more beautiful than silence, a vibrant aliveness in which every sound had meaning, every silence had purpose, and the space between them hummed with connection. As dawn approached, the garden's song softened into the gentle murmur of morning. Illyrian rose and walked among the paths, his staff now humming with the garden's own frequency. He had learned to tend not silence itself, but the quality of listening that makes authentic expression possible. Every step he took created ripples of deep attention spaces where the garden could speak its truth. Walking toward the sunrise, Illyrian felt the profound shift in his understanding settle into his bones. He was no longer trying to quiet the world, but learning to listen so deeply that everything found its natural place in the great conversation of existence. The lesson bloomed in his heart like morning light. True peace comes not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of deep listening. In the mindful garden of authentic expression, silence and sound dance together in perfect harmony. The shadow dancer Vespera moved through the mindful garden like liquid moonlight, her bare feet never quite touching the ground. She was the garden's shadow dancer, weaving stories in the spaces between light and dark, finding beauty in the places where other eyes could not see. Her skin seemed to absorb starlight, and her movements created patterns in the air that lingered for moments after she passed. Tonight, she carried with her an unusual burden. Her own shadow had begun to dance, independently, moving to rhythms she could not hear. The separation had started 3 nights ago. At first, Vespera thought it was simply the play of moonlight through the leaves, but gradually she realized her shadow was developing its own will, its own desires. While she moved with her usual fluid grace, her shadow stumbled and jerked, sometimes falling behind, sometimes rushing ahead. The disconnect left her feeling incomplete, as if part of her soul had decided to take a different path. She paused in a clearing, where the moon cast everything in silver clarity. Looking down, she watched her shadow writhe and twist on the grass, performing what looked like movements of deep pain or profound joy, she could not tell which. Vespera had always prided herself on the perfect unity between her physical form and her shadow self, the seamless integration of light and dark that made her dancing so mesmerizing. Now she felt fractured, uncertain of her own wholeness, sitting cross-legged on the soft earth. Vespera closed her eyes and tried to feel what her shadow was experiencing. At first, she sensed only chaos, a whirlwind of suppressed emotions and forgotten dreams that she had never allowed herself to fully feel. Her shadow, it seemed, was dancing all the grief she had never expressed, all the anger she had transformed into grace, all the wild joy she had carefully contained within acceptable boundaries. As she sat in the moonlight, Vespera began to understand that her shadow was not rebelling against her, but trying to show her something essential about herself. All these years of perfect controlled movement had created a reservoir of unexpressed feeling that now demanded its own dance. Her shadow was not her enemy, but her teacher, showing her the parts of herself she had deemed too messy, too raw, too human for her ethereal art. Slowly, deliberately, Vespera began to move differently. Instead of her usual flowing gestures, she allowed her body to express the jagged edges of frustration, the sharp angles of fear, the heavy weight of sadness she had carried for so long. Her movements became less beautiful in the conventional sense, but more honest, more alive. As she danced these shadow emotions, she felt her actual shadow beginning to sync with her movements once again. The reunion was not immediate or perfect. Sometimes her shadow still moved independently, showing her feelings she was not yet ready to acknowledge. But gradually, Vespera learned to dance with this unpredictability, to include the chaos as part of her choreography, rather than something to be controlled. Her dancing became more dimensional, more human, touched with both light and darkness in equal measure. As the night deepened, Vespera found herself moving in ways she'd never moved before. Sometimes elegant, sometimes clumsy, sometimes powerful, sometimes tender. Her shadow danced with her, now not in perfect mimicry, but in honest partnership, showing her the full spectrum of her humanity. She realized she had been trying to dance only with her light, leaving her shadow to grow restless and rebellious in neglect. By dawn, Vespera's dancing had transformed into something entirely new, not the ethereal perfection she had cultivated for years, but a raw, authentic expression that included every part of herself. Her shadow moved with her in complex harmony, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always truthful. She had learned to embrace the parts of herself she had tried to transcend, finding that they made her not less spiritual, but more complete. As the first rays of sunlight began to dissolve the shadows, Vespera continued her dance, now moving as a whole, being rather than a fragmented one. She had discovered that true grace comes not from perfecting our light, but from embracing our shadows with equal love. The lesson settled in her heart, like morning dew wholeness, requires us to dance with all parts of ourselves, even the ones we'd rather hide. In the mindful garden of self-acceptance, our shadows are not obstacles to overcome, but partners in the dance of becoming fully human. The breathkeeper Aeolian wandered through the mindful garden, carrying a collection of glass bottles, each one containing a different kind of breath. Some held the quick, shallow breaths of anxiety, others the deep, steady breaths of meditation. There were bottles filled with the first breath of morning, the last breath before sleep, and the held breath of wonder when witnessing something beautiful. He was the garden's breathkeeper, responsible for teaching the wind how to breathe properly so it could carry the right messages to those who needed them. Tonight, Aeolian faced an unusual challenge. One of his bottles had cracked, releasing its contents, the breath of letting go into the garden air. Without this essential breath, contained and ready for those who needed it, the garden's visitors would struggle to release what no longer served them. He searched through the moonlit paths, trying to recapture the escaped breath, but it seemed to dissolve into the night air before he could gather it back into its vessel. As he walked past the meditation pond, Aeolian noticed a young heron standing motionless at the water's edge. The bird had been there for hours, perfectly still, yet Aeolian could sense its internal struggle. The heron was trying to catch a fish that had died hours earlier, continuing to wait for something that would never come. Its breathing was tight controlled, holding on to hope that had already transformed into suffering. Aeolian sat beside the pond and watched the heron's patient vigil. He realized that the breath of letting go had not simply escaped, it had been drawn to where it was most needed. The cracked bottle had been no accident, but a teaching showing him that some breaths cannot be contained, but must be released to find their own way to those who require their medicine. He opened his bag and removed all his bottles, setting them carefully on the grass around him. Each one glowed softly in the moonlight, their contents swirling with gentle purpose. Aeolian had spent years collecting and categorizing these breaths, believing that he could control their distribution, deciding who needed what kind of breathing and when. Now he saw the limitation in his approach. Breath was meant to be free to flow naturally, where it was needed. Slowly, deliberately, Aeolian began opening each bottle. The breath of courage spiraled up into the night air, followed by the breath of peace, the breath of curiosity, the breath of gratitude. Each one rose, like invisible incense, carried by the garden's natural wind to wherever it belonged. The heron by the pond suddenly lifted its head, took a deep breath, and with elegant grace flew away from its futile waiting. As the last bottle emptied, Aeolian felt a profound lightness in his chest. He had been holding his own breath for years, trying to control the flow of life around him, rather than participating in its natural rhythm. The empty bottles around him no longer represented loss, but liberation, his and the garden's. He took his first truly free breath in decades, feeling the night air fill his lungs with spontaneous aliveness. The wind that had been still all evening began to move through the garden with new purpose. It carried with it all the breaths Aeolian had released, distributing them according to a wisdom far greater than his own planning. He could sense the breath of letting go, finally reaching a woman who had been holding on to grief for too long. The breath of courage finding a man afraid to speak his truth. The breath of peace settling into the heart of someone who had forgotten how to rest. Aeolian gathered his empty bottles and began walking through the garden, but now his role had changed. Instead of collecting and containing breaths, he became a witness to the garden's natural breathing, helping visitors notice their own rhythms and needs. He discovered that the most healing breath was not something to be given or received, but something to be shared in the moment of recognition between one being and another. As dawn approached, Aeolian found himself breathing in harmony with the garden itself, the rise and fall of wind through leaves, the gentle pulse of sap through stems, the slow exhale of flowers releasing their night fragrance. He had learned that breath was not something to be managed, but something to be trusted, not something to be controlled, but something to be celebrated in its endless, natural flow. Walking toward the sunrise with his collection of empty bottles, Aeolian felt the profound peace that comes from releasing the need to control life's natural processes. He had become not a keeper of breath, but a celebrant of breathing, helping others discover the wisdom that lived in their own natural rhythm. The lesson settled in his heart like morning mist. True healing happens when we stop trying to manage life and start trusting its innate wisdom to flow where it's needed. In the mindful garden of natural rhythm, Our greatest service is simply to breathe freely and allow others to do the same. The memory weaver, the Sarian moved through the mindful garden with fingers that trailed luminous threads, weaving forgotten memories back into the fabric of the present moment. His eyes held the deep amber of ancient tree sap, and his hair flowed like silver water in the moonlight. He was the garden's memory weaver, responsible for helping lost recollections find their way home to the hearts that had misplaced them. Tonight, he carried with him a peculiar burden, a memory that belonged to no one, a golden thread of experience that seemed to exist independently of any mind that might have created it. The orphaned memory had appeared 3 days ago, floating through the garden like a dandelion seed with nowhere to land. The Sarian had tried to weave it into the stories of various visitors, but it would not take hold. It was too joyful for those carrying sorrow, too peaceful for those wrestling with anxiety, too simple for those lost in complexity. The memory seemed to be waiting for someone specific, yet no one who entered the garden felt familiar to its golden light. As he walked past, the remembrance roses, flowers that bloomed only when someone recalled a moment of pure love. The Sarian noticed they were opening their petals despite the late hour. Their fragrance filled the air with the essence of precious moments, a grandmother's lullaby, the warmth of a friend's embrace, the satisfaction of a kind deed done in secret. The orphaned memory in his hands began to pulse more brightly in response to the rose's perfume. The Sarian paused beside the memory pool, a still body of water that reflected not the present moment, but echoes of the past. Tonight, instead of showing individual memories, the pool's surface swirled with images that seemed to belong to everyone and no one children, playing in sunlight that existed in every era, hands reaching out in kindness across all cultures, moments of wonder that transcended time and place. He began to understand that the orphaned memory was not lost, but universal, a golden thread of human experience that belonged to all hearts. Sitting on the smooth stones that surrounded the pool, the Sarian held the glowing memory up to the starlight. Through its translucent surface, he could see the essence of what it contained, the feeling of coming home to oneself, the moment when struggle transforms into acceptance, the quiet joy of recognizing one's place in the larger tapestry of existence. It was not a specific memory, but the feeling that lived beneath all meaningful memories, the golden thread that connected every moment of authentic aliveness. As understanding dawned, the Sarian realized he had been trying to give this memory to someone when its purpose was to be woven into the garden itself. This was not a lost memory seeking its owner, but a gift seeking to become part of the foundation, a golden thread meant to strengthen the entire fabric of the space. He had been thinking too small, trying to heal individual forgetting, when this memory was meant to heal the collective human tendency to lose touch with what matters most. The Sarian rose and began to walk through the garden, not seeking a specific person, but allowing the memory to guide his steps. As he moved, he began weaving the golden thread, not into individual stories, but into the garden's very essence. He wove it into the soil that would nourish tomorrow's flowers into the air, that would carry future dreams into the water, that would reflect countless moments of recognition and homecoming. With each step, the Sarian felt the memory integrating into the garden's living system. The night-blooming flowers opened more fully, the paths seemed to glow with gentle invitation, and the air itself became charged with the possibility of remembering what the heart has always known. He realized that his role as memory weaver was not just about returning lost recollections, but about strengthening the very capacity for meaningful remembrance. As he completed his circuit of the garden, the Syrian felt the orphaned memory finally settle into its perfect place, not in any individual mind, but in the garden's collective heart. From here, it would touch every visitor with its golden essence, reminding them not of specific events, but of their fundamental capacity for joy, peace, and belonging. The memory had found its home, not in one person, but in the space that served all people. The remembrance roses seemed to sigh with satisfaction, their petals catching and reflecting the memory's golden light. The Syrian understood that he had participated in something larger than individual healing. He had helped strengthen the web of connection that holds all beings in recognition of their shared humanity. The garden now carried within it a deeper capacity to remind visitors of their inherent wholeness. As dawn approached, the Syrian walked toward the rising sun with empty hands, but a full heart. He had learned that some memories are too important to belong to just one person, that some threads of experience are meant to weave themselves into the foundation of healing spaces. His work as memory weaver had expanded beyond individual service to collective nourishment. Standing at the garden's edge, as morning light filtered through the leaves, the Syrian felt the profound satisfaction of having participated in something that would serve countless souls. The lesson settled in his heart, like morning dew. Some gifts are meant to be woven into the foundation rather than handed to individuals, strengthening the whole, so that everyone who enters can remember what they've always known. In the mindful garden of collective memory, the most healing threads are those that remind us we have never really been separate from the love and peace we seek. The dawn walker, Celestine. Celestine moved through the mindful garden as the first hint of sunrise touched the horizon, her footsteps marking the boundary between night and day. She was the garden's dawn walker, responsible for greeting each new day and helping the transition from the dream world to the waking world flow with gentle grace. Her hair captured the colors of sunrise, rose gold amber and pale lavender, and her eyes held the quiet wisdom of someone who had witnessed countless beginnings. Tonight was different because she carried with her the garden's most precious secret. Every dawn was actually a choice, and today she would discover what happened when someone chose not to let the sun rise. For countless mornings, Celestine had performed the same ritual, walking the spiral path from the garden's outer edge to its center, gathering the night's dreams and sorrows, transforming them into the light and hope that would greet the garden's visitors. But tonight, as she reached the central grove, where the sun's first rays traditionally touched the earth, she paused. In her hands, she held a small crystal that pulsed with her heartbeat, the garden's dawn heart, the magical source that called the sun to rise each day. The crystal felt heavier than usual, not with weight, but with the accumulated tiredness of endings that had become beginnings of cycles that repeated without rest. Celestine realized she had been walking the same path, performing the same ritual for so long that she had forgotten the magic, lived not in the routine, but in the conscious choice to welcome each moment as completely new. The dawn heart in her hands was reflecting her own exhaustion, her own need to rest in the darkness before calling forth the light. She sat in the center of the grove and closed her eyes, still holding the crystal, but no longer trying to activate it. Around her, the garden waited in unusual stillness. The birds held their morning songs, the flowers kept their petals closed, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in memory, dawn did not automatically break. The sky remained in that liminal space between night and day, suspended in possibility. In the extended darkness, Celestine felt something she had not experienced in ages, the profound rest that comes from not having to be responsible for the next moment. She did not have to summon. The sun did not have to transform anything, did not have to guide any transitions. She could simply be present with the darkness, discovering that it held its own gifts, its own completeness. The crystal in her hands gradually stopped pulsing and began to glow with a soft, steady light that asked nothing of her. As she rested in this unprecedented pause, Celestine became aware of other presences in the garden, all the keepers and tenders and weavers she had glimpsed over the years, but never met. Lyrael with her lantern, Zephyra with her seeds, Myrthen with her dream threads, and all the others who served the garden's midnight magic. They were gathering around her, not to urge her back to duty, but to share in this moment of collective rest, this pause in the eternal cycle of service. One by one, they sat in the grove, with her each bringing their own tired tools and weary wisdom. Together, they formed a circle of servants who had forgotten they also deserved to be served givers, who had forgotten they also needed to receive. In the suspended dawn, they discovered the profound healing that comes from allowing the cycles of life to pause from trusting that the universe could hold itself together while they rested in simple being. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had become irrelevant in the space between night and day. Celestine felt her exhaustion gradually transform into a deeper kind of energy, one that came not from effort, but from alignment with the natural rhythm of rest and renewal. The crystal in her hands began to pulse again, but this time with her renewed vitality, rather than her depleted duty. When she finally opened her eyes, Celestine saw that dawn was beginning to break naturally, not because she had summoned it, but because the earth itself was ready to turn toward the light. The sun rose not in response to her ritual, but as part of the greater dance of existence, and she was simply honored to witness it. The other garden keepers were fading back into their various domains, each carrying with them the gift of remembered rest. As the first rays of sunlight touched the grove, Celestine stood and began her walk back through the garden paths. But now her steps carried a different quality, not the weight of obligation, but the lightness of participation. She was not making the dawn happen, but celebrating its natural arrival, not controlling the transition, but dancing with it. The crystal in her hands had become not a tool of responsibility, but a companion in wonder. The garden around her seemed to shimmer with renewed vitality, as if it too had benefited from the pause, from the reminder that even the most beautiful service requires moments of rest and renewal. The flowers opened their petals more fully, the paths seemed to invite more leisurely walking, and the air itself carried a quality of ease that had been missing for too long. Walking toward the garden's entrance as the morning light grew stronger, Celestine felt the profound shift that had occurred in those suspended hours between night and day. She had rediscovered that true service flows not from obligation, but from overflow, not from depletion, but from the fullness that comes from honoring our own need for rest and renewal. As she reached the garden's gate, Celestine turned back to look at the space she served with such devotion. The lesson settled in her heart, like morning dew. Even those who tend the light must sometimes rest in darkness, and the most beautiful dawns arise, not from force, but from the natural rhythm of renewal. In the mindful garden of service, the greatest gift we can give is to model the balance between giving and receiving, between tending others and honoring our own sacred need for rest. The 10 stories of the mindful garden now complete their cycle, each one offering a gentle lesson about finding peace in the liminal spaces between day and night effort, and ease serving and being served. In the garden, where serenity blooms before sleep, every story is a doorway to the quiet wisdom that lives in the heart of presence itself.